So we moved into a new section of the Catechism now. We've moved into the church community. So now we're going to talk about church, because if there's one thing you'll find discipling people in the urban context is that people have no concept of church. And a lot of people treat church like a club, the same way they treat the football club that their kids go to. 1 week I go to it, 1 week I don't. I take it and I leave it. And so we had to have a whole section on church community to teach people about church. So first question is 42. Which two communities does the Bible often divide people into? The believing and unbelieving communities. So which two communities does the Bible often divide people into? The believing and unbelieving communities. So first, let's look at Matthew 13, verses 24 to 30. So how many different types of plant are sown? Two different types of plant, yeah? Who do the different plants belong to?
One was the master, and the other one was the enemy.
So one is the master. One type of plant belongs to the master. Who's the master in this parable? God, right? And then the other seed belongs to the enemy. Who is the enemy, do you think? The devil, right? So you got two types of different plants. One belongs to the devil, one belongs to God, right? Then it says, next question is, what will happen to the different plants at the end?
The weeds, they'll be separated, and then the weeds will be burnt, and the other will be brought into the barn.
Right, good. Separated. The ones that belong to the devil will be burned, but the ones that belong to God will be brought into his barn. Okay, so let's now turn to Genesis 3:15. And whilst you're turning, I'll just read out the question again. Which two communities does the Bible often divide people into? The believing and the unbelieving communities. And we just saw an example of that in Matthew 13. And some people call this the proto-evangelion, the first gospel, the first good news, the first time you hear the gospel in the Bible. So the reason why I tell you that phrase is just because I read a book recently where they mistakenly called it the proto-legomenon. No, prolegomenon. They said this is the prolegomenon. It's a famous book. It's sold like hotcakes. And I read that and I was like, rah, that's totally the wrong word. That doesn't have the same meaning as proto-evangelion. What do you think in my mind made me think about the rest of the book?
Oh, it's rubbish.
It's making me think, well, this guy makes mistakes. Now, here's the thing. The rest of the book could have been flawless. But I hear someone try to use a Latin word and end up using the wrong word, and it's put in print in a book. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence in it. There might be nothing in it, yeah, but the thing is, what I'm saying, the reason why I gave you the proper Latin term is just like, if you are going to use it, use the right one. So, and I even misspoke as I said it, innit? At first I went to say proto-evangelion. No, when I went to try say prolegomenon, I said proto-legomenon, and that's not, I said that wrong. But so it just goes to show it is worth paying attention to DL in the work we do for God, because if we get our details wrong, people might then think, oh, what you're saying is rubbish. Okay, so someone read out Genesis 3:15, please. Thank you. Now, if you were catechizing someone and they was like, what's enmity mean? What would you do?
You said division. I would explain it.
Okay, and if you didn't know the word, what would you do? You get a dictionary. Oh, I'm so glad, yeah. So glad, yeah. So I don't have to put everything in a teacher's guide, do I? Okay, thank you. So you could Google it. Some of you got dictionaries on your phone. Some of you actually have paper dictionaries in your houses. And so you can do that if you're ever stuck. So I'm glad that someone mentioned that. Okay, good. So I get asked to put a lot of stuff in a teacher's guide. And sometimes I think if I put everything in the teacher's guide I get asked to, you just have this huge, ginormous book, you'd be like, let's consult the teacher's guide. So I'm glad to know people know about dictionaries. Okay, so enmity means hostility, right? So the other thing you can do is look it up in another translation, see what that says. So what two different offspring are mentioned here in Genesis 3:15?
The woman's offspring and the serpent.
Thank you. The woman's offspring and the serpent's offspring. Those are the two different types of offspring that are mentioned. How is the relationship between the two described?
So the offspring from the Eve will eventually crush the serpent.
Yeah, that's good. If you could pick one word to describe the relationship, opposing, hostility, enmity, that's what we're looking for here. Is there's hostility in the relationship between these two offspring. Okay, now let's go to Genesis 4:1-8. How many offspring has Eve got at this point? She's got 2 offspring, okay? How is the relationship between the 2 offspring? It's hostile, right? There's the beef. There you go. So, okay. So you might see where we're heading with this now. Let's go to 1 John 3:9-10. So how do people born of God behave?
Right, in the right way.
In the right way, which would be what? Not sinning, not practicing sin, loving brothers and sisters. Now we know from the rest of 1 John and from earlier in the Catechism that you can't say you don't sin. So obviously John doesn't mean that if you're a true Christian, you won't have any sin. But I think what it means is you won't just keep perpetually just being stuck in the same sin and just living it and rolling around in it like a pig wallows in mud and rolls around in the mud. But you will be repenting of those sins and you will be growing in them, and sin will not be your master because you've been freed from sin. Would anyone else like to add to that verse? Maybe anyone who's got any good insights on that verse. Don Carson talks about in maybe it's American English or something, or he saw a sign somewhere that says, or no, maybe he's talking about, he was saying where it says you cannot sin, he sees it as kind of like if you say to someone, you cannot chew gum in this class. It's like physically you're able to chew gum in the class, but listen, man, if you're in this class over ministry program, you cannot chew gum here. That's not necessarily the case, by the way. We've never made a rule about chewing gum. But so I think that's the way Don Carson sees it. But the point is, as someone who's born of God, you will be living your life a different way. Yeah? And you'll be loving your brothers and sisters, which we'll come on to later in the Catechism. So now let's go on to verse 12. If someone can read out verse 12, please. 1 John 3, verse 12. Which set of offspring did Cain belong to? What's that? The devil's, right? The devil. So what I find is when I read people the story of Cain and Abel, people don't want to think that Cain is one of the offspring of the serpent. Surely not. And then you get to 1 John, and it says, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the devil. In Greek, it actually says ek tu poneru. So ek, the Greek word from out of, is saying Cain is from the devil. And in Greek, you could say someone is ek someone. They are from someone, meaning they are the offspring of someone. So you could translate this as Cain, who is the offspring of the devil. So John did actually think that Cain was the offspring of the devil. And that just helps us understand that story a whole lot better of what was going on there. Okay, so the question is, what set of offspring did Cain belong to? He belonged to the devil's offspring. So what might you now be thinking? Yeah, so maybe Abel she's considered as the woman's offspring, and then it's like, well, what does that mean? So we'll have a look at that now. Let's go, we're going to look at that in a minute. First, we're going to look at 1 John chapter 5, 19. So just turn on a couple more chapters. Who else is the offspring of the devil?
Every unbeliever.
Every unbeliever. So it's saying there, we know that we're children of God. The whole world is offspring of the devil. Now, John often uses world to talk about a rebellious system, a system that has rebelled against God. John uses the word world in different ways. It's a fascinating Bible study looking at the different ways he uses world. Often he's using it as a rebellious system. You hear people talk about Babylon. John would talk about the world. He'd say the world. And if you're a believer, you're not part of the world. So here John's making a distinction. Anyone who's not a believer, they are part of the world. They're part of this rebellious system against God. Okay, so let's now go to Hebrews 11, verse 4. This helps us answer the question of, what is the believing community? And, in what way do we see that Abel was an offspring of the woman that was different to how Cain was an offspring of the devil? Because you might think, well, surely if you're just born of Eve, you're an offspring of the woman. And that was something that obviously a lot of Israelites thought in Jesus' day. We're born of Abraham, so we're okay. And consistently they get told by Jesus and John the Baptist, no. And then later by the Apostle Paul. So could someone read out Hebrews 11, verse 4, please? What did Abel have that showed he was the offspring of the woman? Faith. He had faith. So it's his faith that showed he was the offspring of the woman. And what is the thing that shows that we're offspring of Abraham today? Is faith, right? Yeah, we've done that in biblical theology. Okay, so which two communities does the Bible often divide people into? The believing and unbelieving community. I've given you a diagram there, believing and unbelieving community, yeah? This is the way I see the way the Bible divides us up. This is actually my own thing. So when I was at Oak Hill for my long dissertation, I wrote something called seed theology. And that's what this is. And basically seed theology is, in Reformed theology, is called the antithesis. And the antithesis is talking about the stark contrast between dark and light. But it's only been used in apologetics. So the way the antithesis has been used is people say, listen, when you're explaining the gospel to people, when you're giving a reason for your faith, which is what apologetics is, when you're doing evangelism, understand the person you're talking to is in the kingdom of darkness. It don't matter how many DVDs you show them, showing them the manuscript evidence of the New Testament or how we got the New Testament, they're in the kingdom of darkness. They're not going to believe unless the Holy Spirit does a work in their life, which will happen through his word by the power of his Holy Spirit. That's the doctrine of the antithesis, right? Now, so what I did was I took the doctrine of the antithesis and said, let's apply that to a council estate. How does this work? If there's darkness and light, if there's a stark contrast between darkness and light, how does that work in a believer's life on an estate? And I found this was such a crucial doctrine because what I was seeing was, in the early days, you set up a Bible study and you're waiting for some young person to turn up, yeah? And they never turn up. And you find out later, on their way to Bible study, they bumped into their old crew. And at first they thought, let me just share the gospel with them. And then what happens is people in that old crew get a joint out and they start passing it around. And the person's like, nah. A few minutes later, pass it around, nah. A few minutes later, I wonder what would happen if I just had a little toke of this joint. Take it, then a bit later a bottle comes out, they start drinking that, then you never see them till the next morning and they phone up and say, I've messed up. And I saw this happening a lot with different people, and I was like, this just keeps happening in council estate ministry. People who seem to want to be following Jesus, but they keep bumping into their old mates or their family. Their family saying, you're not getting baptized. And you're going to baptize someone and they say, oh, I'm not getting baptized now. My mum told me I shouldn't get baptized. And so I kept seeing this come up. So I did a whole dissertation on this doctrine of the antithesis, darkness and light, the hostility between the believing community and the unbelieving community, and looking at how do we use this doctrine to help us do better discipleship in council estates. And at this part in the Catechism, you get a sneak peek into seed theology. But next term, when we do the mission module, you'll get to study it more in depth. So, in my diagram here, I've got two circles. The believing community, people who believe in Jesus, and the unbelieving community. This is the way I'm dividing up humanity. You're either in the believing or the unbelieving community. And now let's go to another verse, Ephesians 2, 1-6. So, can people be moved from one group to the other? Yes. Can we? Amen. Wow. See, everyone's really enjoying the gospel today. Okay, so, yeah, good news, right? At first, it's a bit depressing, this diagram. And then you're like, you can be moved from the unbelieving community to the believing community. Do you realize you get the privilege of sometimes taking non-believers through this and showing them this diagram? And actually showing someone, mate, you're here. But you can come here by God's grace. You're not left here. How many people do you think that the church view it as you're here, unbelieving community, and you're stuck here because you're not like us? I think a lot of people think that's what we think, right? So what a wonderful privilege to be able to show people you can come over through Jesus Christ. Yeah, that question?
Yeah, when I was taking someone through that, a new believer, and also actually a couple of believers, they always ask, can the believers be taken from the believing community back into the unbelieving?
That's the question. This is the question that keeps coming up. Well, like I say, I'll give you my paper on it, on the apostates in Hebrews. So I would say that there are lots of people, you see examples of it in the Bible, and you see examples of it in real life in your churches. There's lots of people who look like they're in the believing community, and later they desert it and go to the unbelieving community. And I would say that these are people that they're described in Hebrews 6. The descriptions in Hebrews 6 are people who have experienced the same things a lot of the Israelites experienced when they came out of Egypt. Seeing the Spirit at work. Seeing God's power and blessings, being around that and being like, yeah, and everyone thinks they're a believer, but when later they move to the unbelieving community, you realize they weren't a believer. And you realize that, and so that's a very sad thing that happens. Now, I realize some of you have got kids who you're thinking, well, what about them? And I think with kids, it's really tricky because with some of our kids, we might have thought before they were in the believing community and now they're in the unbelieving community, and we might think, does that mean there's no hope for them? Well, I would say with some of our kids, at the beginning it looked like they were part of the believing community just because they used to come to church with us all the time. And they picked up a lot of our mannerisms, and a lot of it was sociological. I wouldn't necessarily say that then they would be falling into this Hebrews 6 category of apostate, and now they've lost it, don't even bother praying for them. I'd say with children, it's very hard. Sometimes people use the phrase that children don't have their own faith. Sometimes people say they have their parents' faith. And a bit later, you realize, yeah, they have their own faith. So by this, I don't want anyone to think if you've got teenagers now that you're like, they're not walking to the Lord. I'm not saying give up on them. So please don't misunderstand that as me saying that. There's an application question here which is quite deep. And you've got to be really honest about this. What different communities do you normally divide people into? Now, you've got to be honest with this, yeah? We all like to say we're not racist. We all like to say we're not prejudiced, yeah? And I just think, come on, guys. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. There's ways that we divide people, we divide up society in different ways. For example, some of us do this, yeah? Some of us divide people up by, well, the obvious one is race, yeah? Some of you might remember back in the day when you had the diaspora coming into London. So first in London, you had black, that was West Indian, right? And then like West African, yeah? And that was okay, you know? Then what happened? You started getting, for some, but I'm kind of taking on the persona of, and of what some people said. And then what did you start getting? Do you remember when Somalians started coming into London big style? No one liked them, right? You had West Africans and Jamaicans in London who were looking at the Somalians and saying they're filthy and all this kind of stuff. You had whites who were saying the Somalians, they're filthy. Don't mind the Jamaicans, you know. They came here and they adopted our culture. They put their nappies in the bin. But these Somalis, do you know what I heard? I heard, and then people start quoting what the tabloid newspaper had front page, yeah? And then we got used to Somalis, right? And then you started getting youth gangs where you'd have Somalis and black British, and then, you know, and it all started getting mixed up. But then you started getting the Eastern Europeans come over. They're stealing all our jobs, all this kind of stuff. And then you get Albanians come over, and people start thinking all the Albanians are car thieves and, slave traders, traffickers and everything, And so you keep seeing it.
And Muslims, I think.
9/11, anyone who is Arab or someone who looks Arab, they're not Arab, but, then, carrying a backpack, and then, that's it. And then Muslims as well, and then a lot of us Christians, start getting paranoid. The Muslims are taking over, start acting a certain way. So some of us have been dividing community these ways, and then some of us have been dividing community by sex. There's a reason why at New Life Church we have men's meeting and we have women's meeting, because history has shown us that men and women's meeting together has lots of arguments and fallouts at it, because we've grown up with so much hostility between men and women. I remember as a kid, right? Citizens Advice Bureau on the corner there. I remember walking in there as a little boy, right? And the place was just full of women sitting around complaining about men. I was petrified. I just walked in and they're just like, my man, he's done this. Men, they're rubbish there. And I was like, I was so scared. And I grew up constantly hearing women say how bad men were, because I'm in a single parent family, so I'm hearing the women say how bad men are. Then as I get older, and you start getting to go places where the men are, right? You go to the pub and that, and then what do you hear? How bad the women are, And then what do you see on Facebook the whole time? Just comments about how useless men are, and then men making jokes about women drivers and all women are this and all that. And so what a lot of us do is we divide up humanity into men and women. And then we do things that way. And some of us men, shamefully, we have a biblical view that's called complementarianism, which means that men and women complement one another and they have different roles, but they're equal and they complement one another. And some of us use that to justify the way we view humanity as men and women. And we use it to justify that although we say men and women are equal, we actually think men are better. And it's just like in the playground, boys are elastic and girls are fantastic. It's like we're still on that tip, still, this battle of the sexes. And what I find seed theology teaches me is, no, these are your categories, believing and unbelieving. Women in the church, they're in the believing community. Men in the church, they're in the believing community. Don't be always commenting on how bad the other sex is and making out that they're the problem. Don't always be thinking other races are the problem. Oh, have you seen the way these people drive? They don't drive in their country, They don't drive proper. They don't have a proper test or nothing, Don't be dividing people up that way. Divide it into believing or unbelieving. Here's another way we divide people up. Class, right? So I'm not guilty of this at all. Those of you who know me. So basically, a lot of us, basically, like my story was, growing up, I was told I was scum of the earth, So I grew up for years thinking me and my mum were scum. Then I started finding out that there was a certain coolness about being from a council estate. As I got older, I started seeing middle-class people who wished they were from an estate. I started seeing posh people who started putting on a London accent and stuff like that. And then I started getting posh people say to me, "Oh, Duncan, you're well hard," And suddenly I was like, wait a minute, this is cool. I'm working class. I'm from a council estate. And then you get a very strong identity in that. But then, especially because I went to a local church school, which now isn't posh, but when I was a kid, there was just me and one other kid from the estate. So, and then later there was a girl who joined. So there was like three of us. And I got proper persecuted for being from the estate. And that's not just by the school kids. That was from some of the teachers, right? So that meant that I grew up thinking middle-class people are bad. Working class people are good. You can trust them. But then middle-class people, man, they will cause you a whole world of pain and trouble. Don't trust them. So some of us do that, and we need to see, no, it's believing and unbelieving. In the believing community, there's people of all kinds of classes. In the unbelieving community, there's people of all kinds of classes. Another way you do it is hard workers and spongers. Well, they're a hard worker. I like them. But they're a sponger. They live off benefits. And so that's another way that we divide people up, and we're not supposed to divide them that way. And now there's a place in the church for saying if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. So there's a place for that. But if your mindset is always dividing people up into hard workers and sponges, you've got a problem. Another way is postcodes. What postcode do you live in? Now, all of us are hopefully now too old to be into the whole postcode thing anymore, But again, that's a lie of the devil, right? That's a lie of the devil. God divides us between believing and unbelieving. You got the unbelieving community warring with one another about what postcode they live in. Very funny as well, because the postcode was devised by the system. So ain't that funny? People who rebel against the system and chat about how bad the system is, and they end up fighting along the lines of the system. And you see the same thing in Africa. People fighting along lines that the Brits and the Dutch and whoever said years ago, Belgians and that said, these are the lines for you. And people went, this is simplistic, but people said, okay. And then, but haven't we all done the same thing, believing the lies that we get sold about how to divide up communities? So what I'm saying is the way we divide people up is a distraction from the way that God has divided people up. And there's a guy called pt, some of you might know of him. He's a pastor in the Cayman Islands. He done a talk at T4G, Together for the Gospel, a few years ago on race. And it was deep because he was basically talking about this thing, but he didn't use the same terms as me. He was saying that from his perspective, he would basically be like, look, it's not that I don't like white people, it's just that I love black people. And he was saying that that would be quite common in America. And he was saying that's the wrong way to view things. He was saying that's the wrong way to view things. He said, when you see someone of another ethnicity, you should think that is someone who's in Adam, just like I was. I want them to be in Christ, just like I am. So you see an Arab and you think that's someone who's in Adam, just like I was. I want them to be in Christ, just like I was. You're black and you see someone who's white, you say, that's someone who's in Adam, just like I was. I want them to be in Christ, like me. You're black, you're white, and you see someone who's black, you say, that's someone who's in Adam. I want them to be just like me, in Christ. And what Tabiti said was that the whole race thing don't work anyway. And he just goes through how because some of you know about, we might cover this next time, I think, about race theory, which is a construct that we've been given. That's why I resent when I go to America and people call me Caucasian. It's like, that's race theory. Like, that's nuts. That's like calling someone a mongoloid. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We all know how, in some ways, it's misleading to say black, because what does black mean? Are we talking West Indian, West African? Even if we're talking West African, what kind of West African are we in this room? We've got, how many West Africans we got in this room? Right, and all from different countries. We got Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone. So we got all these different countries here. So even the term black doesn't communicate that. And then people say black culture. What's that mean? There's loads of white people who are into so-called black culture. Some people say black culture when they mean MTV culture. It gets proper confusing. So Tabiti was saying, talk in terms of nations. He was saying, because in the Bible, you see it talking about nations all the time. So talk in terms of nations. That's his suggestion. The main thing I'm driving home today is think in terms of believing and unbelieving community. Now, in the teacher's guide, I've given you some stuff in there for further study there. The Bible will often use terms such as darkness and light, dead and alive, in order to convey these two communities. The Bible also talks about godly seed, offspring, and the offspring of the devil. The difference between these two communities is that one has faith in God and the other does not. The unbelieving community was first founded by the devil when he tempted Eve to doubt God's goodness and hence not have faith. God, however, changed Eve's heart, causing her to have a dislike for the devil instead of friendship. Remember, he says, I will put hostility between you. This is the first example of regeneration, of someone having their heart changed. Saying, Eve, I'm going to change it so you don't like the devil no more, so you come back and believe in me. Reformed theologians refer to this as the antithesis. At New Life Church, we called it seed theology. Now, I know some of you, as soon as you heard seed theology, what were you thinking? Some of you are thinking weed. Maybe some of you think of that a lot.
money and then you get a load of money.
So some people, when they hear it, they think we're saying if you put some money in the offering, you will get 100 times back. That's not what we mean. Here's the thing, yeah? I had to try hard to come up with a term for it. Seed theology was something that I come up with. I needed a term for it. And in the end, this seemed like the best term. I know that some people talk about giving a seed, but I think the Bible uses the term seed far more times talking about the two communities and the offspring. So you call it offspring theology or seed theology. In some ways, I kind of just want to redeem that word, you know. But if a lot of you are like, do you know what, this is just too unhelpful in our context, let me know, and maybe we just change the name of it. So any questions on that? Sammy?
I was chatting to someone the other day and they were saying about how they had a culture at their church, and it just sounded like it caused just a lot of, I don't know, confusion, like division, unrest, people felt uncomfortable. And I wonder how much in church is it helpful for us to be like that? It's obviously extreme, but how helpful is it to be referencing our culture often? Like, do you feel like that alienates others, or are we trying to just do it? We are a believing community and that's what we're pushing.
It's a very good question. The question is, if we reference our culture, if we talk about our culture too much in church, could it end up making people feel uncomfortable and not helping people see it's basically about the believing or the unbelieving community? We're going to look at this in the mission module. My quick answer would be, bear in mind your church has a culture. It does have a dominant culture to it, most probably, okay? So there's two extremes. One extreme is to say, no, we don't talk about our cultures. We just have Bible culture. And then all the worship songs are white middle class worship songs. And the preaching style is white middle class preaching style. Well, you have a dominant culture of white middle class. Everyone's wearing suits. That's not black culture. That comes from white culture, that we made black people wear suits when they came to church in the Windrush generation. So the suits is not a black thing, although maybe you could argue today it has become that. But so I would say, be careful of saying we just have Bible culture, because the reality is we don't. And I would now, so that would be one extreme. The other extreme is where you make the culture the biggest thing, and you never look at how your own culture needs to be transformed by the gospel. So it would be wrong to say, well, we're like at New Life, we're all council estate people, so it's all about council estate culture. No, we want to say, we do want to represent council estate culture because we want to reach other people from council estates. And we lose missionary power if we reject our own culture. But we also want to be transforming the culture the whole time. So in our church. So we want our church to look like council estate culture that has been redeemed by God and is being made more and more like Jesus. So the good things like loyalty, man, you see some good loyalty on council estates. We want to keep that in the church, you know. But then the bad things, like, well, I could go all day long about the bad things. The bad things we want to changing, lack of responsibility, victim mentality. We want to ditch them things. But multicultural church is very hard to do. It'd be a big conversation, but it's very hard to do. It involves educating your people. I find that this is a good start for me, educating my people, because I find that we naturally want a certain culture. So you can think that, oh no, I don't have a problem with different races, and then someone joins your church from a different ethnicity and they're cooking Sunday lunch that Sunday. And you get some food that you're not used to. And you think, it'd be nice if we could have it more like it used to be. And so what I would say, a few things to point you in the right direction. Last year, 2013, the Reach and the Unreached conference, Ephraim done a good talk on culture. That's on our church YouTube channel, New Life London. And there's a great book by Manny Ortiz, which is about multi-ethnic church. It's the only book I know that really gives, I don't know, I can't claim to be an expert on books on multi-ethnic church. It's the first book I've read, let's put it that way, where I was like, wow, this guy really goes in deep about how to have multi-ethnic church. If you think you have a multi-ethnic church, read this book. I bet later you'll say, oh my days, we don't have a multi-ethnic church at all. Because he gives you key things, and he says, unless you've got this in your church, that ain't multi-ethnic. Don't tell me we have 5 Filipinos. Like, if they aren't seriously involved in shaping the culture of your church, then don't say it's a multi-ethnic church. He doesn't quite, I'm being unfair to many of us, he's much more gracious than that. He kind of gives different models of multi-ethnic church, saying you get some like this, you get others like this, but basically he's saying the goal is this, and he paints a picture where your church leadership and the influences on the church and the food and the worship and all that kind of thing gets influenced by the different cultures. It's hard work, and you have to work at it, and you have to be intentional about doing it. It doesn't just happen. The hardest, what do you think is the hardest thing that stopping true multicultural church? And the majority culture in the congregation. It's that the minority culture in the church, normally it isn't so much of a problem. It's the majority culture, because once you become a majority culture, it's very hard to see things through the eyes of a minority culture, because everything's done the way you want it. That, you know, and especially if your church has been going for a few years, you start getting comfortable in it. This is the way we do the offering. Don't tell us in the Bible this is how to do the offering, but this is the way we do it. And you get really comfortable. Then another culture come in and they want to do things a bit different. We're like, nah, sorry, we don't do it like that.
Does it help to have someone from a different culture in the leadership team, so that someone who comes in sees that person and thinks, you're part of this church, then, you can see that maybe they will be influencing what's going on within the church as well.
There's been lots of studies to show what Neil's saying, whereby if you have mixed leadership, you tend to have more of a multicultural church. People turn up and they're like, this is a church for me. So you tend to have more multicultural if you have mixed leadership. That's why I don't want New Life Church in the future to have all white leadership. I don't think that would be healthy for the church, and it wouldn't reflect the local area. Now, I hear a lot of people knee-jerk react to that, and they say straight away, well, we don't want tokenism. But I'm like, that sounds really bad. So you're saying if we get an Asian person on the eldership, it will be a token. How do you know that Asian person wouldn't be the best leader in your church? Like, tokenism, it's like, it's only tokenism if you get a real duffer and you don't equip them for ministry and then you put them in leadership. But it really bothers me that people straight away say, oh, we don't want tokenism. It's like, boy, that's a real prejudiced thing to say.
I think it's also quite relative as well, because at least for those of us who've had church background, what you consider as multicultural might not be what, maybe the ideal multicultural is. So like, for instance, the church that I go to, from my perspective, even now, I think it's really multicultural, but then other people walk in and be like, no, it's not, there's one particular person here, but it's because I'm used to churches where they follow the leadership. So if the leadership is Nigerian, most of the church is Nigerian. If the leadership is Sierra Leonean, so that to me is streamlined. Whereas if you've got maybe a leadership that is, I don't know, from Barbados, and then you've got, some English, even if the majority, well, let's say, 50% was from Barbados, but there were other people there, that from a perspective that I would be coming from is multicultural. And I think also for people who are coming from the background that I've come from, what you find makes you quite feel excluded is when the leadership speak in their language from the pulpit and the majority laugh.
Yes, true.
And you're kind of, I don't actually know what was just said, and it's fair enough if it's once in a while. I don't know if you find this in Roehampton, depending on what church you go to, but if the leadership are making jokes, that excludes anybody who's not from that culture or that country. That's when it gets quite hard, even as a believer, to feel kind of like, well, I don't know what's going on, so that can be hard as well.
And that's why, so when New Life Church started, there were a lot of young people in it, there were a lot of youth. Our first service, I think, the majority of the church was maybe under the age of 20. So there was a lot of slang in the sermons. I don't use much slang now. If I ever use slang, I then use a second sentence to qualify it. So sometimes it slips out. Sometimes I might say there were bare people, and then I'll say there were loads of people. Because, Iranians sitting in the room are thinking, naked people? So me saying there were bare people, but then when they hear me say there were loads of people, they're like, oh, that's what that means. What a funny phrase. Where's that come from? So I toned down my slang as we started getting more people from other countries, and as we started getting older people in the church. Then I was like, I don't want to exclude people from the gospel. But you're right in that different people have different perspectives of what's multicultural. I remember chatting to Gabs one time and I was saying like, man, I wish the church was more mixed. And Gabs goes, oh, that's one of the things that drew me to the church was how mixed it is. And I'm like, what, you feel like New Life is mixed? And he's like, yeah. And, when I look on paper, it is actually mixed with lots of different nationalities. But then when I look at the neighborhood, I say, but we're not quite reflecting the mix of the neighborhood. And we need that more in the leadership, I think. And I think you have precedent for that in the book of Acts. When they got problems with the Hellenistic widows not getting enough food, and then you get, and it's interesting, I've seen some commentators who are like, well, we don't know if it really was the case, they weren't getting enough food. And I'm like, that's someone from a majority culture, isn't it? Surely they wouldn't have been overlooking those Hellenistic, it's like, so that's why it's good to have a variety of commentaries from people from different backgrounds, But so what do? They appoint a bunch of deacons who have got Greek names. So they end up appointing people in leadership who, in the deacons anyway, that I wouldn't necessarily say that's leadership, but in some ways it can be. And those are people who are from the culture where they're trying to help the people, So
I can see the benefit of Duncan teaching it this way. We're faithfully teaching that this is of first and utmost importance that you're either part of the believing community or unbelieving. Then we're able to celebrate the cultures within that. So where I might message out, I don't go away thinking I have nothing in common with these people. I realize actually we're all believers, and that's a cultural nuance or whatever. But we're all what's first importance is that we're in a believing community with Christ. So I think doing it this way seems to me to be.
So good discussion. We discuss this much more on the mission module. So for now, turn to the person next to you and ask, what different communities do you normally divide people into? I've also, you notice there's some seed theology videos there. If you want to study this seed theology stuff more, watch the videos. We've found recently in a survey that almost no one at New Life Church watches the videos in the Catechism. I'm thinking of taking 90% of the videos out, so I just leave a handful of ones that I think are really important for people to watch. Seed theology is something I'd say that's quite unique, so it's something that I'm hoping people watch. But we will be covering seed theology next term as well, so you'll get a good dosage of seed theology.
I just found out that the people that are taking through Catechism now are watching the videos.
They are now.
No, they are.
They are. So now people are watching the Catechism video. We also found out, I said to you, threes is better. Well, in a recent survey, we found a lot of people have preferred one-on-one because they said people share more in one-on-one. But having said that, looking at the surveys as well, there's some examples of people who've gone one-on-one that haven't got a lot out of it. But I think that can be down to the individual, and it can often down to their attitude. And I think if someone hasn't got something out of it, it can be because they're taking an attitude of, I already know this. So my ears always prick up when if I say to someone, what did you get out of the Catechism? And they say, I already know this stuff. I'm like, interesting. I know it. I wrote it. I get convicted every question. So, and I learn more about my sinful heart every time. So, and I have to confess stuff in front of my kids. So it's like, so sometimes you find out that sometimes people just go into it with the wrong attitude. But we can encourage that by being honest. So when you do this with someone, don't say, oh, I only view people in terms of believing, and I just don't believe you. I just don't believe you, yeah? I can't believe that all of us here only view people in this term.
I think you just the way you used before that, you unpacked actually what different ways that we can, that for me, so you hit me on about 5 or 6. If you hadn't done that, I might have been tempted to go, yes. Do it in this way, but actually now I'm like, where do I begin?
Yeah. And some of Some of us are doing this in theological circles, right? So when I was in Pentecostal church and charismatic churches, we viewed it as this circle is the people who are doing supernatural gifts. And these people are churches that don't have that. Oh, those poor people. I mean, they're nice people, but they ain't got it. Then later you go to another church where you end up being, well, if you're reformed, you're in this circle. And if you're not reformed, well, then you go to another church. Well, if every sermon is working verse by verse through a book of the Bible, then you're in this circle. And we have all these different ways we divide it up. And in heaven, obviously, it'll be a big surprise when we're, all mixed together. And we're like, oh, you're here, and they're like, you're here, So, okay, so do that question with the person next to you and then just pray together.